Good morning and welcome to today's Meet the Author event. We're thrilled and honored to welcome Dr. Julian Zelizer of Princeton University to present his new book on Abraham Joshua Heschel. Rabbi Heschel was a legendary scholar and activist. He remains an inspiration in today's social justice movements. This program is sponsored by Addis Israel in Washington, D.C. and Congregation Bethel in Bethesda, Maryland. We're grateful for the support of the Addis Israel and Bethel sisterhoods, as well as the Bethel Library Committee and Men's Club. I'm Robin Jacobson, the librarian at Addis Israel. I also co-facilitate Bethel's book club together with Marge London. As a welcome for Dr. Zelizer and a salute to Abraham Joshua Heschel, Marge and I have chosen Zoom backgrounds to highlight different periods of Heschel's life. I'm in front of Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, Ohio. This is the school that saved Dr. Heschel from the Holocaust by making him a job offer that made him eligible for a US visa. And when you see Marge shortly, you'll see that she's greeting you from a lovely courtyard at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. This is where Heschel spent most of his scholarly career. But before we turn to Heschel, a quick look at some upcoming online events. Next month, on Sunday, March 27th at 11, we'll discuss literary luminary Cynthia Ozick's new novella called Antiquities. And then on Sunday, April 24th at 11, we'll welcome science journalist Andrew Lawler to present his new book about archaeological expeditions. The book is called Under Jerusalem, The Buried History of the World's Most Contested City. Looking ahead to summer, we're excited to announce that the historical novelist Geraldine Brooks is returning. She'll be introducing her newest novel, Horse. The book has already won pre-publication praise for offering a multi-layered reckoning with America's legacy of enslavement and racism. The links to register for these Zoom events are in the chat box. If you register early, you will automatically receive the bonus materials that we send out several weeks in advance of each program. Turning to today's program, Marge will introduce Dr. Zelizer, then Dr. Zelizer will present Abraham Joshua Heschel, A Life of Radical Amazement, and then we'll open up the question program for Q&A. If you have a question for Dr. Zelizer, you can raise your electronic hand at any time, and we'll turn to your questions when we reach the Q&A period. To raise your hand electronically, click on the button labeled Reactions, which is probably located at the bottom of your screen. Then choose the option Raise Hand. We will not be recording the Q&A period, so no need to hold back. And Marge, you can go ahead as soon as you are spotlighted, which I will do in just a moment. Let's see. So many participants, it's hard to find Marge.
At the beginning, I think.
Sorry about that. This usually goes very fast. This is a faster way to do it. Okay. There you go.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm honored to introduce our distinguished guest, Dr. Julian Zelizer. At Princeton University, Dr. Zelizer is the Malcolm Stevenson Forbes Class of 1941 Professor of History and Public Affairs. His area of expertise is United States political history in the 20th and 21st centuries. Professor Zelizer is also a CNN political analyst, a regular guest on NPR's radio program Here and Now, and the co-host of a popular podcast called Politics and Polls. A prolific writer, Dr. Zelizer is the author or editor of 22 books, including the recent 2020 New York Times notable book, Burning Down the House, Newt Gingrich, The Fall of a Speaker and the Rise of the New Republican Party. Beyond his books, Dr. Zelizer has published incredibly over 1,000 op-eds. We sent you one of those op-eds about Rabbi Heschel in last week's bonus drop. To the study of Abraham Joshua Heschel, Dr. Zelizer brings his own unique lens. As a historian, he looks at Rabbi Heschel in the context of 20th century American history. But as a member of a rabbinic family, the son and grandson of rabbis, as well as an observant conservative Jew himself, Julian Zelizer also brings a religious sensitivity to the study of Heschel. His book carefully unravels the intertwined threads of Dr. Heschel's theology and activism. We feel privileged to have Dr. Zelizer visit with us today. His book, Abraham Joshua Heschel, A Life of Radical Amazement, is available for purchase from Politics and Prose, both during and after the program. See the chat box for the link and discount code. And as Robin said, if you have questions for Dr. Zelizer, you can raise your electronic hand as they occur to you, and we'll turn to them during the Q&A period. Robin wants to say a brief word, and then we'll hear from Dr. Zelizer.
Thanks so very much, Marge. As many of you know, we are dedicating this morning's learning to Marge's late husband, Shelley London, who died in January. Shelley was passionate about Judaism and about learning and about helping people. He had a marvelous flair with words. For these and so many other reasons, it feels appropriate to dedicate a program about Abraham Joshua Heschel to Shelley. So please go ahead, Julian, as soon as you are spotlighted. And we look forward to hearing from you. You have a very enthusiastic group here.
Well, thank you so much. And it's wonderful to be with all of you. It's really an honor, and it's an honor to be part of a program with such a beautiful dedication. And I'm looking forward to speaking to all of you. I'm sorry I'm not in Washington, as we were saying before the show, one of my favorite cities, and I haven't been there for a couple of years, and I look forward to getting back. But always impressed by the robust Jewish community in our nation's capital. It's a pleasure spending time talking about Abraham Joshua Heschel through this book, and I'll give you just a little brief synopsis for those of you who are not really familiar with his life, about who he was and how he ended up on the streets of Selma. We're marching at the Arlington Cemetery. And then I just wanted to offer 3 ways in which I think his story is really relevant in 2022, beyond just an amazing biography, ways in which his career, his ideas, his legacy, I think, speak to some of the issues facing the country, as well as the Jewish community in our current times. His life is a remarkable story. It's in some ways a classic immigrant story from the period. He's born, Heschel, in 1907, and he's raised in Warsaw. He comes from a family of distinguished Hasidic rabbis, and he grows up as a young boy being trained to be a Rebbe himself. My book looks at his life in Warsaw, both his family life as he's undergoing this training, and very quickly proves to be quite brilliant in understanding and discussing Hebrew texts. And I go through some of the tragedies that he suffers, including his father's death when he's very young during the influenza pandemic in 1916. One of the things I look at in Warsaw, which was quite interesting, was the city was bubbling with Jewish life. There's a very large Hasidic world of which he's a part, but there's also other kinds of Jewish activity that are going on all around him. There's a world of radical laborites. There's early Zionists are in the city. There's a whole community of Yiddish poets and playwrights who are very secular, but inhabit the same streets that Heschel is walking on. And part of the story of his youth is both being immersed in this very deep and rich Hasidic tradition, learning the stories of the Baal Shem Tov, but at the same time, watching, observing, and even participating a little bit in this other world, including writing poems for this institute of playwrights and poets. And so he's fascinated from a young age at the connections, the tensions, the relationship between the sacred and the secular, between the religious world and secular Judaism that's going on around him. He decides to leave Warsaw and he wants to go to the university. So first he goes to the gymnasium at Vilna, where he essentially finishes his high school studies, receiving the kinds of secular education that he needs. And then he goes to Berlin, where he studies at the University of Berlin, one of the greatest institutions at the time. And he's there in the early 1930s as the Nazis are rising to power and start to become such a destructive and horrible force, both in Germany and ultimately in the world. But during his time at Berlin, he loves it. He's studying with some of the best philosophers at the time, and he decides to concentrate his studies on philosophy. He'll get a PhD, writing a dissertation about the prophets. He's very immersed in the intellectual / social networks of the city, meeting some of the finest thinkers and having robust discussions about philosophers, as well as theology, as well as their different understandings of God. He ultimately receives his PhD, and he will move to Frankfurt, where he takes over a very esteemed adult education institute that he runs and enjoys very much. But ultimately, he, like many Jews in 1938, is kicked out of the country by the Gestapo, rounded up, quickly has to take his things, his belongings, and to leave. He's brought to a camp, but ultimately is able to survive through connections. He gets back to Warsaw. Heschel's life continues. He catches the attention of someone named Julian Morgenstern. And Morgenstern is the head of the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, Ohio, which is the seminary that's training Reform rabbis and has become an important institution by this time. And Morgenstern is trying to save a number of Eastern European Jewish intellectuals by bringing them to HUC. And he gets Heschel's name through various scholars and will offer Heschel a fellowship to come to the United States and to spend some time in the institution. It takes Heschel some time to be able to do this. It's very hard to get a visa, and it's a frustrating process where Heschel's almost unsure that he's going to be able to get to the United States, terrified about everything that is happening. He is able, in the interim, to go to London, where he spends time with his brother, who lives there. But ultimately, in 1940, he gets the visa, he comes to the United States, and he goes to Cincinnati. And I have a chapter covering then his life in Cincinnati. He's there from 1940 to 1945, which are frustrating years in many ways. It's very hard for Heschel to be ensconced in a seminary of Reform rabbis, where many of the students didn't have the same kind of knowledge of Hebrew or biblical texts that he would expect of people being trained as rabbis. He was often, very frustrated and disappointed that the kitchen wasn't kosher, and he couldn't even eat most of the food at the time. It's also difficult in that these are the years of World War II and the Holocaust. He is listening all the time and through a transistor radio that he has in his room about the events in Europe. Several members of his family, including his mother and 3 sisters, will be killed, both through the Holocaust and through the war by the time this is over. So personally, it's a very devastating few years, and he feels the impact of the war very immediately. And during those years in Cincinnati, and I'm happy to talk about this in the Q&A, he starts to get some taste of activism. For example, during the summers, he spends his summers in New York so he can be close to the Jewish Theological Seminary. He attends a big rally in New York City in Madison Square Garden, where there are speakers calling for the government to pay more attention and to do more to save Jewish refugees. In 1943, Heschel is one of the rabbis who goes to Washington and participates in something called the Rabbis March, which is a group of 400 very observant rabbis who march through the streets of Washington in protest of the lack of attention that Jewish refugees are receiving. They even meet with members of Congress, and they end their event at the Lincoln Memorial, where they chant traditional Jewish songs to the traditional American tunes like the Star Spangled Banner. And so he starts to get a taste of this during these difficult years, but he's frustrated because he doesn't think the protests are generating enough attention. He believes that the non-Jewish community is not interested, not doing enough to address this crisis. And he's very frustrated with fellow Jews and the Jewish community, including the leaders of major organizations who he doesn't think are really mobilizing to change conditions at this desperate time. He moves in 1945 to JTS. Louis Finkelstein, the chancellor of JTS, offers him a position as a professor of theology. And the next decade plus, which I cover in the book, revolve around his life in New York. He gets married to Sylvia Strauss, a very talented pianist who he had actually met back in Cincinnati. And he spends the next decade really working on his scholarship. He writes a series of major books that continue to be read through this day. Man is Not Alone, which comes out in 1951, and God in Search of Man, which comes out in 1955, both books that wrestle with the relationship between individuals and God, and thinking about how individuals could, through piety and through spirituality, open themselves up to being able to hear the voice of God, both the anger and the passion that he said God had. He wrote a book, The Sabbath, also in 1951, which is circulated in many synagogues around the country and through many Jewish communities, which makes a very powerful and beautiful argument about the Sabbath and how Judaism is a religion that tries to commemorate and mark time as opposed to space. And this book is very important to kind of spreading his popularity. It becomes the basis of a national campaign to promote Sabbath observance. And his book, along with all kinds of programming, are sent out to synagogues all around the country. Man is Not Alone, the book that comes out in 1951, also helps him gain attention because it's reviewed by one of the most important theologians of the time, Reinhold Niebuhr, with whom Heschel would become very good friends, who writes that this is a very important book and argues this is the arrival of a major voice in theology. And in the 1950s, it's just he loves New York. It's the center of Jewish life at the time. And I go through the different texts, some of what he argued, also how they were received. And it was interesting to see him become a national figure. His work is covered in magazines like Time Magazine and Newsweek. So by the early 1960s, when he publishes the book, The Prophets, which will be very important to him and to his reputation, a revised version of his dissertation, he's already a pretty established figure. And the final chapter of the book goes through his life as an activist. And many of you might be familiar with this period in his life. And later, I think we're going to show two of the photographs. I'm going to talk a little bit more about it. When he gets very involved in the social justice movements of the period. He's one of the early figures calling for more attention and for some kind of mobilization to save Soviet Jewry and to address the conditions that Jews living in the Soviet Union faced on a daily basis. He's involved with a group in Cleveland, Ohio, as well as some figures in Washington who are trying to create a movement that really won't flourish until the 1970s. But Heschel's very early on this question. He forms a good friendship with Elie Wiesel, the writer, who credits Heschel with awakening him to this issue and inspiring Wiesel to go write a book about this that would help generate support for the movement. Heschel's involved in negotiations with the Vatican during Vatican II about the Vatican dealing with doctrine that had been used as part of anti-Semitic discourse throughout history through World War II. He's a secret liaison through the American Jewish Committee to these negotiations. And finally, the two that I want to expand a little bit on in the next few minutes. One is he becomes involved in the civil rights movement starting in 1963 when he goes to speak at a conference in Chicago that Martin Luther King had helped organize about religion and race, and gives a keynote address that receives a standing ovation and is an incredibly powerful and potent talk about how you cannot actually be religious and racist at the same time. A strong message to preachers and religious figures who are basically sitting on the sidelines as the civil rights movement unfolds. And he spends the next few years involved in the movement, primarily by speaking to different regional conferences, such as the one he spoke to in Chicago, and even speaking on campuses. And then it culminates in 1965 when he, on March 21st, joins King and other civil rights leaders in a march in Selma, not the first march, the Bloody Sunday March that many of you are familiar with, where John Lewis is brutally attacked, but a march a few weeks later to build support for a voting rights bill. And here you can see the photo that has really become quite iconic of Heschel marching in the front lines. And then he'll get involved in 1965. There you can see the photo. And they're wearing Hawaiian leis around their neck, which is a symbol of love. He gets involved in the anti-war movement. He, in 1965, joins a group of fellow interfaith preachers in starting a group called Clergy and Laymen Concerned About Vietnam. And it's notable in that he, in 65, is doing this before there's really an anti-war movement in this country. In 65, support for the Vietnam conflict was very strong. There wasn't a very robust movement, but he gets together. At first, this group is calling for people protesting the war to be allowed to do that. But by 66 and 67, this is an interfaith group with figures like William Coffin or John Bennett of the Union Theological Seminary that is kind of creating a moral backbone to the opposition to the war. And it becomes very important. In 1967, this group will invite Martin Luther King to speak at the Riverside Church in New York City and to give a talk protesting the war. And King had not really done that in a major setting at that time. He was worried because no one wanted to anger Lyndon Johnson, who had been supportive of the civil rights movement. There were many civil rights leaders who still supported the war, and the anti-war movement was seen as pretty fringe and radical, more so than the civil rights movement. But they invite King, and King, with Heschel sitting, you can see in the videos on the table right behind the lectern, he gives a very important speech in the history of anti-war politics in the 1960s, where King comes down very strong against the war. And it's at an event run by this group, CalCAV, Clergy and Laymen Concerned About Vietnam. And Heschel will deliver a speech at that event as well, with increasingly strong language about the moral injustice that was going on as a result of US policy. And then he finally passes away in December 1972 on a Friday night on Shabbat as a result of severe health problems. He had a heart attack in 1969, and he would suffer another. And the last time anyone sees Heschel at that moment is an interview that I end the book with that was on a show hosted by Carl Stern, where there's a lengthy interview, and I urge you to YouTube it. You can watch it yourselves, where he goes through and recalls many parts of his career and thoughts about being a social justice advocate, even though so much of history wasn't turning the right way, including the assassination of Martin Luther King. And it's taped, I think, 10 days before he passes away, and it airs soon after his death. And then at the end, I talk about his ongoing legacy and the ways in which he has remained such an important figure, in some ways a more important figure after his death in American Jewish life. So I just wanted to talk about three ways in which I think his story, that I hope you read through the book and can spend some time with him, is so relevant today as we deal, both the American Jewish community and the United States more broadly, with so many questions in these difficult times as we live through a pandemic, as we live through so many questions of social injustice. One is an issue that's often discussed whenever the Pew Foundation releases a new report or a new version of its report about some of the disconnect that we're seeing between younger Jews and Jewish institutions, particularly the synagogue. And one element of Heschel's life that really came out as I spent so much time looking through the archives, which caused tensions at JTS, was his ongoing critique of both the rabbinate and suburban Jewish synagogues. He's at JTS at a moment where there's competing arguments, debates about what was best to keep Jewish life revitalized and strong here in the United States. He came at this question from a theological perspective, talking most about spirituality and inner piety. Mordecai Kaplan was another major figure at the time whose work had a great influence on young rabbis who really focused on the synagogue as the centerpiece of Jewish life, and the synagogue as an institution that could preserve social and cultural Jewish tradition and make it relevant and interesting and exciting in post-war America, where Americans were enjoying new kinds of quality of life and moving further away from their Eastern European or German roots. And for him, the synagogue was so important. And then there were scholars like Saul Lieberman and others who really focused on halakha, Jewish law, and following the Jewish law. Heschel is a critic of some of the direction in which American Judaism is going. He believes for sure in Jewish law and the mitzvot, but at the same time, he writes that the Jew had to approach this with the right kavanah, with the right kind of spiritual framework. And he's worried during his career that we focus too much on institution building and not enough on the inner life of the Jew, which ultimately is what he argued would form the connections that are important to endurance. And I go through all these moments in the book where he is pretty direct in his criticism. He's not subtle. And this is in the 50s as he's teaching younger rabbis, as he's working at JTS. One example took place at the Breakers Hotel in June of 1953, when he's speaking to a convention of rabbis, and Mordecai Kaplan is sitting in the auditorium. And Heschel really offers, I'm just going to read the words instead of paraphrasing them. Quote, "Our services," he said, "are conducted with pomp and precision. The rendition of the liturgy is smooth. Everything is present," he said, "decorum, voice, ceremony. But one thing is missing, life. One knows in advance what will ensue. There will be no surprise," he said, "no adventure of the soul. There will be no sudden burst of devotion. Nothing is going to happen to the soul. Nothing unpredictable must happen to the person who prays." In the most famous line of this address, he says, "Has the synagogue become the graveyard where prayer is buried?" And I think some of this critique, he also had critiques of rabbis who he said were very good at giving sermons that sounded like New York Times op-eds, but not teaching congregants how to pray or not spending enough time on faith, are important today, whether one disagrees or agrees with what Heschel was arguing at a moment when the Jewish community is living through weakened affiliation, struggles within Jewish institutions, also at a time when the pandemic, I believe, has opened up some new questions about how should Jewish life actually be structured and what are some new opportunities that have emerged. His questions about what goes into the person, what goes into the soul, as opposed to the focus of post-war Judaism, which was building and filling Jewish institutions, are incredibly important today. And his writing, I think, adds to the conversation that we are all having about where the Jewish community goes next. A second area where he remains incredibly relevant is the connection between social justice politics here in the United States and religion. Since the 1970s, the period I teach undergraduates about in a big lecture course, the main story of religion and politics has to do with the religious right. It's a story about the mobilization of evangelical conservative Christians, the connection of what was called the moral majority, founded by Jerry Falwell, and Republican politics from Ronald Reagan onward, through today, when there's lots of discussion in the media and even with scholars in the role of the religious right and the modern political coalition. And we've even seen changes within the Jewish community. There's been a growing presence, even though Jews remain pretty liberal and pretty democratic in their voting, but a growing presence of conservative Jews, both individuals and at an organizational level. And another thing that's happened is debates over Israel have increasingly pushed some of these social justice debates aside within the community. And I think Heschel's a really powerful way to look back at the 60s. And I wrote about this in that op-ed that it sounds like you shared, and to see the way in which there have been moments, in the 60s, a big one, where religion played a role in moving and shaping and stimulating efforts to achieve social justice here in the United States. And what's so interesting to me about Heschel is he didn't just do this as a Jew who was interested in working on civil rights in the war, but a deeply religious Jew who saw and couldn't not see the connections between his understanding of Jewish texts, of Jewish spirituality, and the questions that people like Martin Luther King or Ella Baker were raising in their fight for equality, or the questions that the John Bennetts and others were raising in their fight to end this war in Vietnam. And this is really an important thread of the entire book. Some of this comes from Heschel's own life, of course, as an immigrant who had family members, including his mother, killed during the war, as someone who understood what hatred could look like and manifest itself through the Holocaust, and to see what the cost of indifference was, which he saw in Germany when he said Christians were not sane or speaking out against Nazi power, or here in the States where Christian Americans or even Jewish Americans were not doing enough to address the crisis. He never wanted that to happen again. And throughout a lot of his writing or speeches, he would refer to not making that same mistake. And kind of the role of religion in progressive politics, I think, can be quite important, even for secular activists who don't come from the same perspective. But Heschel and his colleagues offered a kind of moral clarity and moral power to these arguments that was quite effective in framing these debates, in thinking about these debates. Heschel himself always saw this. Heschel even talked about how in the Black church and preachers who were getting involved in the civil rights struggle, he saw in that community what he desperately wanted in the Jewish community as well. And And I urge you to kind of see this in his work when he gives this speech I referred to in Chicago in January of 1963, when he talks about racism and religion. It's an incredibly powerful framing of the issue, one that really spoke, I think, to people like Martin Luther King, who liked the prophetic language, who had that as a way of speaking about the civil rights crisis in a way that resonated. I read you just a line from the speech. I happen to have the book right next to me. He said, "By negligence and silence, we have all become accessory before the God of mercy to the injustice committed against Black Americans by men of our nation. Our derelictions are many. We have failed to demand, to insist. We have failed to chastise." He argued that racism was a form of blasphemy, of Satanism, in the kind of language many prominent liberals weren't using at the time. And there's a scene in the book that I really love that I found in his own notes about the Selma March, where he was leaving after the first part of the march, and he's being driven with his friend Wolf Kellman to the airport by a young student who was a Reform Jew. And he drives them there after having participated in the march. And he tells Heschel that he never was affiliated with Judaism. It never meant that much to him. But after seeing this march and after being part of this, he understood his connection to the tradition in new ways. And Heschel wrote a little note to himself saying, "Jewish religious institutions have again missed a great opportunity, namely to interpret the civil rights movement in terms of Judaism. The vast numbers of Jews participating actively in it are totally unaware of what the movement means in terms of prophetic traditions." So I think that relationship has gotten more attention in recent years. You have figures like Rabbi Jill Jacobs, who heads the organization Trua, or Reverend William Barber, who's become very prominent in forging some of these connections. But I think Heschel's a terrific starting point for this conversation as this element of American politics tries to grow and tries to gain new life. And finally, one other element that I think is relevant today, for Heschel, interfaith dialogue was incredibly important throughout much of his career. And I feel that in the times we're living in 2022, this also feels incredibly urgent to think of conversations and find people and find organizations that can connect different religious groups and different religious congregants, as too many fault lines have separated us and pulled us apart. He gives a really great speech when he is appointed visiting professor at Union Theological Seminary, the first Jewish scholar to have an appointment like that. And he gives an address after being appointed there called "No Religion is an Island." And he says the following: "The religions of the world are no more self-sufficient, no more independent, no more isolated than individuals or nations. Energies, experiences, and ideas that come to life outside the boundaries of a particular religion or of all religions continue to challenge and to affect any religion. We fail to realize that while different exponents of faith in the world of religion continue to be wary of the ecumenical movement, there is another ecumenical movement worldwide in extent and influence: nihilism. We must choose between interfaith and nihilism. Cynicism," he said, "is not parochial. Should religions insist on the illusion of complete isolation? Should we refuse to be on speaking terms with one another and hope for each other's failure? Or should we pray for each other's health and help one another in preserving one's respective legacy, in preserving a common legacy?" And this outlook was important not only in how he thought of religion or the conversations and connections he forged with figures like Reinhold Niebuhr, but it was important in his role with the Vatican, where there were many Orthodox rabbis who didn't believe it was legitimate for a Jew to engage in theological discussions with the Vatican. Heschel insisted it was important. It was important with his work both on civil rights and Vietnam, where as a very religious Jew, a very devout Jew, he kept pushing to see some of the connections and ultimately how those informed his own fight and their fight collectively for social justice. So clergy and laymen concerned about Vietnam is an embodiment of how this interfaith approach connected to the world of politics, but it was broader than that. It wasn't simply the politics, it was simply the outlook and the kinds of conversations he insisted were central if we wanted to preserve a place for spiritual life in the modern world. So those are three reasons I think, and there's more, that his story is so important for us today. Kind of more robust discussions about what it means to be religious and how we can be religious and pious. The progressive religious political tradition, which I think has just faded over the past few decades. And finally, the centrality of interfaith dialogue. And I thought I'd just end by reading just a couple paragraphs from the end of the book, and then I will turn it over to Q&A. Heschel's insistence on the ways that religious piety and social justice intertwine enriched the meaning of American Judaism during his lifetime. He and like-minded American leaders propagated an understanding of their religion that inspired a greater commitment toward fighting for a world that respected human rights and social equality. He teased out key elements of the theology that were too often ignored as middle-class American Jews settled into the material comforts of assimilated Cold War America. His writing offered them a spiritually infused interpretation of their religion and religious practice, different from the ritualistic and socially oriented version that dominated most suburban synagogues. All of his work, from the Sabbath to the prophets, was grounded in his vision of an intimate relationship between God and humans. He put forth a deep poetic interpretation of why congregants should spend their time praying and adhering to tradition. For progressive political movements outside of the Jewish community, Heschel and his generation of preachers offered a spiritual foundation for social justice struggles that were often fought on secular ground. In a country where religious institutions still held a respected place in mainstream communities, these voices helped grassroots activism appeal to a wider range of the populace, even on the most controversial matters. Like the Hebrew prophets, Heschel tried to answer the spiritual crisis facing the modern world. He saw politics in moral terms. The emptiness of our souls was directly connected to the violence all around us. Jews needed to open themselves up to the radical amazement of accepting the reality of the divine and living a life where every action was informed by religious value. That will remain his clarion call to action until the terrible wrongs, as Heschel called them, are wiped away, when crass materialism, social injustice, and unnecessary military force stop claiming the powerful hold that they still have on our society. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian. That was just great. What an illuminating look at a remarkable man and a remarkable period of time that offers such rich ideas for our own time. As you said, a clarion call. So to learn more about Abraham Joshua Heschel, you can read Julian's book, which I highly recommend. It's very readable, very informative, and very inspiring. And again, the link to purchase copies of the book is in the chat. If you have a question for Julian, please raise your hand electronically. And to do that, as I said before, you click on the button labeled reactions, which is probably at the bottom of your screen. Then choose the option raise hand. You're not going to be recorded because the recording will stop momentarily after I ask a question or two, which I will do now to get us started. So Julian, I had a question about Heschel's Hasidic background. I wondered whether Heschel encountered any criticism from the Hasidic community or from surviving family members for being so engaged in the secular world and not living a Hasidic lifestyle?
Yeah, so I mean, one part of Heschel, which is really interesting that some scholars have written about, is how Hasidic tradition clearly informed his writing, even when he wasn't explicitly doing that. And he continued to wrestle with it and to explore its meaning throughout his life. And even when he marches in Selma, in that photo, he'll say afterwards, he felt like he was marching with the Hasidic rabbis back in Warsaw. That was the feeling that it evoked. But within the Orthodox community, he doesn't have the same standing that he does within conservative and Reform Judaism, which is to this day. He doesn't have the same clout. His writing doesn't receive the kind of treatment it's increasingly received in the broader Jewish community. And there was criticism, ultimately, of the kind of life and networks in which he embedded himself, even though he remained kind of very rooted, not only in the traditions, but in the learnings from his childhood. And I found really interesting story that one of his students actually went to Williamsburg, where he had family, and spent some time at the synagogues there, and wanted to just experience what it was like. And he came back to meet with Heschel and said, like, why wasn't Heschel living there, and why, like, that seemed to be a perfect fit. And I don't remember the exact quote that I have in my book, but he said something along the lines of, like, I understand, but now I am a modern man. And that wasn't the world he was going to go back to. So the criticism was there. I think he was aware of the criticism, but ultimately, I think he really, really loved first the intellectual, religious/intellectual communities of New York City. And for all the problems, there were connections with JTS that I think worked. And then the world of activism. And I think for him, he just moved in that direction despite what you're talking about.
Thank you. Very interesting. So I'll ask one more,
Sure.
And then we'll turn to the audience. This is about the title of your book, Abraham Joshua Heschel, A Life of Radical Amazement. You talk about this in your book, but I wondered if you would share with us here, what did Heschel mean by radical amazement?
Yeah, it's a really interesting idea that informs his books. It's kind of the foundation, I think, for this book, Man is Not Alone, and God in Search of Man. And he depicts God as a God of pathos. He sees a God, he believes in a God that has human emotion, essentially, can love and hate, and sees the world for all its flaws. And a lot of what he's writing it about is how does an individual, essentially, this is kind of to boil it down, how do they open themselves up? I mean, one of his arguments is that we have become not immune, but we're indifferent to so much of the world around us in that post-war period where there were social sciences and science and consumer goods. And part of what he's trying to write about is that inner part of the individual, how through practicing the Jewish mitzvah and how through attention to piety and prayer, they could open themselves up beyond their own ego. And they could open themselves up to the point where they can be radically amazed by parts of the world they don't even notice anymore, ultimately as a pathway to hearing God. And this is how he writes about the Hebrew prophets. And if you read the Hebrew prophets, which comes out as a book at this high point of the civil rights movement, here are people who have done this, and then they're raging in the world about all the social injustice and all the bad things that are happening that we're indifferent to. And one of the stories I have in the book, which is it's a familiar story, when he would walk down Riverside Drive here in New York City, he would always point, to the trees and say, "Look at the trees, look at the trees." And the point is to kind of make sure that doesn't get out of your scope, and finding a way to have that radical amazement about the clouds and the beauty of the world as a pathway to hearing God.